Before my granddaughter's wedding, I discovered his plan. Then the ceremony turned into a rest. The wedding had been talked about for more than a year, and now it finally felt real. Every phone call, every family visit, every quiet moment seemed to circle back to the same topic. Invitations were printed. Dresses were altered. Gifts were wrapped and rewrapped. The granddaughter had grown up in this family's home, running through hallways and laughing at dinner tables. And now she was about to stand at the center of everyone's attention. For the family, it felt like watching time fold in on itself. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The grandmother watched everything quietly. She had lived long enough to know that big events carried hidden meanings. Weddings were not just about love or celebration. They were about change. About promises made in front of others. About power shifting hands. She smiled when people looked her way, nodded when opinions were shared, and listened more than she spoke. That had always been her way. The house buzzed with activity whenever relatives visited. Someone was always discussing seating plans, food choices, or the guest list. Voices overlapped, laughter filled the rooms, and phones rang constantly. The granddaughter moved through it all with excitement and nervous energy, glowing in a way that made the grandmother's chest ache with pride. She remembered holding her as a baby, whispering comfort during bad dreams, and cheering quietly at school events from the back row. Still, beneath the pride, something else lingered. A feeling she could not easily name. It was not fear exactly, but it was close. More like a steady pressure that refused to go away. The grandmother had learned not to ignore such feelings. They had guided her through difficult years, even when logic told her everything was fine. The groom appeared often during the final weeks of planning. He was polite, well-dressed, and always said the right thing. He greeted elders with respect, offered help without being asked, and spoke warmly about the future. Others seemed impressed by him, even charmed. He knew how to stand, how to smile, how to listen just enough. The grandmother noticed the details others missed. The way his eyes moved before his words followed. The way he adjusted his tone depending on who was listening. It was not obvious or crude. It was careful, measured, like someone who had practiced being agreeable. One afternoon, while the women discussed flower arrangements in the living room, the grandmother overheard a conversation in the hallway. The groom's voice was low, urgent. Papers shuffled. A whisper about deadlines and signatures. When she leaned slightly to hear better, the conversation stopped. Footsteps moved away, and the groom reappeared moments later with an easy smile, asking if anyone needed tea. She told herself it meant nothing. Weddings involved paperwork. There were venues, vendors, payments, and legal forms. Still, the moment stayed with her. As the days passed, similar moments appeared. Short calls taken outside. Text messages answered with quick glances around the room. Conversations that stopped when others entered. The grandmother watched from her chair near the window, pretending to read while listening carefully. The granddaughter seemed unaware, or perhaps simply too busy to notice. She trusted easily. She always had. She believed that love meant honesty by default. The grandmother did not want to disturb that belief without reason. She remembered being young herself, certain that kindness always meant safety. During a family dinner, the groom brought up finances casually. He spoke about joint accounts, shared responsibilities, and starting fresh together. His words were smooth, reasonable. Heads nodded around the table. It all sounded practical. The grandmother noticed how quickly the topic moved toward paperwork. How often he used phrases like, just to make things easier, and it's standard. When someone asked a question, he answered without hesitation, as if he had prepared for it. Later that evening, the grandmother asked the granddaughter how she felt about all the financial arrangements. The granddaughter laughed softly and said she trusted him completely. She said he was taking care of everything so she wouldn't be stressed. Her voice held relief, not concern. The grandmother smiled and said nothing more. She did not want to plant doubt without proof. But inside, Her unease grew. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, the grandmother sat alone with her thoughts. She remembered her own wedding. The excitement. The promises. The things she had not understood at the time. She also remembered the moments she wished someone older had spoken up, even gently. The next day, she offered to help organize documents for the wedding. It seemed like a harmless suggestion. Everyone was busy, and extra help was welcomed. She sorted envelopes, contracts, and receipts with careful attention. Some papers were missing. Others were copies without originals. When she asked about them, she was told they were being handled elsewhere. The answers came quickly, without irritation, but also without detail. She noticed how often the groom positioned himself near the documents. How he offered to carry them, store them, or review them later. Always helpful. Always in control. The grandmother began writing notes to herself, small reminders scribbled on paper she kept hidden in her bag. Dates. Names of offices mentioned. Amounts discussed. She did not know yet what she was looking for, only that she needed to remember. One afternoon, she watched the granddaughter sign a document without reading it closely. The groom stood beside her, pointing to where to sign, speaking softly. The grandmother almost spoke up, then stopped. The document was taken away before she could ask to see it. Her heart beat faster than usual. She told herself she was overreacting. That age made people cautious. That happiness sometimes looked different from the outside. Yet the pattern continued. Urgency crept into conversations. Deadlines appeared suddenly. Decisions needed to be made quickly, before the wedding date arrived. There was always a reason not to wait. Relatives began commenting on how organized the groom was. How lucky the granddaughter was to have someone so responsible. The grandmother listened, nodding politely, while her thoughts moved elsewhere. She decided to speak privately with the groom. Not to accuse, but to understand. She chose a moment when the house was quiet, when others were distracted. She asked simple questions. Where certain papers were stored. Why some deadlines were so tight. How certain arrangements would work after the wedding. He answered smoothly. He did not raise his voice or show anger. He smiled, thanked her for her concern, and explained everything in a way that sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. As he spoke, the grandmother noticed how he avoided specifics. How his answers circled around details without settling on them. How often he used general terms instead of clear ones. When the conversation ended, he thanked her again and said he admired how much she cared about her granddaughter. The words were kind, but something in his tone felt final, as if he were closing a door. That night, the grandmother slept poorly. Dreams came and went, filled with unfinished sentences and unsigned papers. She woke before dawn with a familiar certainty. Something was wrong. She did not yet know what, but she knew it mattered. The wedding was still weeks away. To everyone else, it was a time of joy and anticipation. To the grandmother, it had become something else entirely. A quiet watch. A careful waiting. A promise she made to herself to stay alert, no matter how happy everything appeared on the surface. She looked at her granddaughter the next morning, laughing over breakfast, unaware of the shadows forming at the edges of celebration. The grandmother felt both love and responsibility settle heavily in her chest. Whatever was happening, she would not look away. Not this time. The days leading up to the wedding passed quickly, almost too quickly. Every morning brought a new task, a new message, or a new request for help. The house felt fuller than usual, not just with people but with expectations. Laughter came easily, but silence felt heavier than before. The grandmother kept herself busy. She folded clothes, arranged small gifts, and helped wherever she was needed. On the surface, she appeared calm and supportive, just like everyone expected her to be. Inside, however, she felt restless. The unease she had noticed earlier had not faded. Instead, it had grown sharper, like a quiet sound you cannot unhear once you notice it. One afternoon, She stepped outside to place freshly washed linens on the drying line. The air was warm, and the sun hung low enough to cast long shadows across the yard. As she moved slowly, she heard voices coming from the side of the house near the storage room. She did not intend to listen. She was simply passing by. The voices belonged to the groom and another person. The tone was low, controlled, and serious. It was not the kind of voice people used when chatting casually. The grandmother paused, more out of habit than curiosity, and waited for the conversation to move or end. At first, the words sounded ordinary. There was talk of timing, coordination, and making sure everything was finalized before the ceremony. Anyone could have mistaken it for wedding planning. She was about to walk away when one phrase caught her attention. Once it's done, there won't be any room for questions. The grandmother stopped moving. Her hands tightened around the basket she was carrying. She told herself it could mean anything. Venues often needed final confirmation. Paperwork had deadlines. Still, the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She stayed where she was, hidden from view by the corner of the wall. The voices continued, steady and unhurried. "We just need her signature now," the groom said. "After that, it's automatic." The other voice responded quietly, asking if there was any risk. The groom laughed softly, not with humor, but with confidence. "She trusts me," he said. "That's the easiest part." The grandmother felt her breath catch. Trust was spoken about so lightly, as if it were a tool rather than something earned. She leaned slightly closer, careful not to make a sound. The conversation moved on to details she did not fully understand at first. There was mention of assets, access, and waiting periods. Words like protected, locked in, and post-marriage were used again and again. No one raised their voice. No one sounded angry or emotional. That was what frightened her the most. This was not a conversation fueled by love or excitement. It was structured, planned, calm. The other person asked what would happen if the granddaughter changed her mind later. The groom answered without hesitation. "She won't," he said. "And even if she does, it'll be too late to undo it." The grandmother's heart pounded so loudly she was afraid it might give her away. She pressed herself closer to the wall, her mind racing. Too late to undo what? What exactly was being decided without her granddaughter's full understanding? The conversation ended shortly after. Footsteps moved away. The grandmother waited until the yard fell silent again before stepping back into the sunlight. Her legs felt weak, as if she had run a long distance without realizing it. She returned inside slowly, placing the linens down with shaking hands. Her thoughts felt scattered, but one truth stood out clearly. What she had heard was not accidental or careless. It was intentional. Someone was planning ahead, not for a shared future, but for control. She replayed the words again and again in her mind, afraid she might forget something important. The phrases repeated themselves, each time revealing a little more meaning. Signature. Automatic. After marriage. Too late. She realized then that whatever the plan was, it depended on timing. It depended on trust. And it depended on her granddaughter remaining unaware. That evening, the house filled with relatives again. Conversations overlapped, food was served, and wedding talk dominated every room. The grandmother participated just enough to avoid suspicion. She smiled when spoken to and answered politely, but she felt disconnected from the joy around her. She watched the granddaughter closely. She saw how relaxed she was around the groom, how easily she laughed, how confidently she spoke about their future. There was no sign of doubt in her eyes. That made the grandmother's chest ache. At one point, the groom joined them, placing a hand gently on the granddaughter's shoulder. He spoke warmly, asking if she needed anything. The gesture looked affectionate, even caring. The grandmother saw something else entirely. She saw possession. Later that night, when most of the guests had left, the grandmother sat alone in her room. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle. Only then did she allow herself to fully react. Her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what she had heard. She did not yet know the full details, but she knew enough to be afraid. Not for herself, but for the young woman who trusted too easily. She considered speaking immediately, telling the family what she had overheard, warning the granddaughter without delay. But doubt stopped her. What if she misunderstood? What if she caused panic without proof? The groom had not said anything openly cruel or illegal. Everything had been wrapped in careful language. Accusations without evidence could backfire. They could make her look suspicious, overprotective, or confused. The grandmother knew she had to be careful. She decided to observe more, to listen when possible, to pay closer attention to documents, conversations, and behavior. If something was truly wrong, patterns would appear again. Over the next 2 days, she noticed small changes. The groom became more attentive whenever paperwork appeared. He checked envelopes twice before sealing them. He reminded the granddaughter gently but firmly about deadlines. The grandmother also noticed how often the word later was used. We'll explain later. You don't need to worry about that now. After the wedding, everything will be clearer. Later was becoming a dangerous word. One afternoon, she found a document left briefly on the dining table. It was not meant for her eyes. She did not read it fully, but she saw enough to recognize legal language. Terms about ownership and authority stood out, even to her untrained eye. Before she could look closer, the paper was taken away. The groom apologized lightly, saying it was nothing important. The grandmother nodded, hiding her growing concern. That night, she barely slept. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation by the storage room. The calm confidence in the groom's voice haunted her. This was not a man acting on impulse. This was someone who believed his plan was secure. By morning, the grandmother made a quiet decision. She would not confront him yet. And she would not frighten her granddaughter without clarity. Instead, she would prepare. She began organizing her notes more carefully. She wrote down everything she remembered word for word. She marked dates and times. She kept the papers hidden among old letters no one ever touched. She also resolved to speak to someone she trusted, someone outside the immediate excitement of the wedding. Someone who could listen without dismissing her concerns. As the wedding day drew closer, the house felt brighter to everyone else. To the grandmother, it felt like a ticking clock. She watched her granddaughter sleep peacefully one morning, unaware of the careful planning happening around her life. The sight filled the grandmother with both love and urgency. What she had overheard could not be ignored. It was not emotional or accidental. It was calculated. And whatever was being planned would not reveal itself until it was too late. The grandmother promised herself one thing as she stood by the window, watching the day begin. She would not let silence become regret. The morning after her realization felt strangely normal. Sunlight came through the windows the same way it always did. The house smelled of tea and toast. Voices moved from room to room, talking about errands and final wedding details. Nothing on the surface reflected the weight pressing on the grandmother's chest. She sat at the table longer than usual, staring into her cup as if answers might rise from the steam. Doubt crept in slowly. What if she had misunderstood? What if she had heard fragments and built fear around them? Accusations of deception were serious. Lives could be damaged by a single wrong assumption. She reminded herself of this again and again. Calm. Careful. Do not react from fear. The grandmother had learned long ago that truth did not need drama to reveal itself. It revealed itself through patterns. Through repetition. Through details that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. She decided that if what she had overheard was real, it would leave traces behind. Her first step was observation. She paid close attention to how conversations unfolded when the groom was present. She noticed how often he redirected discussions away from specifics and toward reassurance. Whenever questions arose about paperwork or timing, he stepped in quickly, smoothing concerns with practiced ease. She watched how documents moved through the house, how some were left openly on tables, while others were never out of his sight. The important ones always seemed to disappear quickly, as if their existence alone required control. The grandmother did not rush. She waited for moments when no one was watching. When the house was quiet, she looked through drawers meant for shared storage. She did not search aggressively. She simply paid attention. What she found was not dramatic, but it was telling. There were copies without originals, pages missing from sets, dates that had been moved forward more than once, signatures already placed where discussions were supposedly still ongoing. She compared these details to what she remembered hearing by the storage room. The timing matched. The urgency made sense. The need for signatures before the ceremony suddenly became clear. Her hands felt cold as she laid the papers back exactly where she found them. That afternoon, she reviewed her own notes from earlier weeks. Conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time now carried weight. The groom's repeated emphasis on after the wedding stood out sharply. So did his habit of presenting decisions as already settled. She thought about his past behavior as well. How quickly he had positioned himself as the organizer. How naturally others had stepped back, relieved to let him take control. It was not forceful. It was subtle. The grandmother recognized the pattern. She had seen it before, though never so close to home. Still, denial whispered in her mind. Perhaps she was projecting old fears onto a new situation. Perhaps her age made her cautious to the point of suspicion. She tested that thought by speaking casually with a relative who had worked in legal offices years ago. She did not mention names or details. She simply described a general situation, asking questions about timing, signatures, and authority after marriage. The answers unsettled her. Certain arrangements, once finalized, could not be easily reversed. Some decisions made before marriage gained stronger legal weight after. Trust, when combined with poor understanding, could be dangerous. The grandmother thanked the relative and changed the subject. Her doubt weakened. Over the next day, she noticed another detail. The groom avoided discussing options. He spoke only about outcomes. There was never a "we could choose this," only "this is how it will be." The language of partnership was missing. She also noticed how gently pressure was applied. Deadlines were framed as unavoidable. Questions were brushed aside as unnecessary stress. The granddaughter was encouraged to relax, to enjoy the moment, to leave the complicated matters to someone else. The grandmother watched this happen with growing clarity. This was not love guiding decisions. This was strategy. One evening, she sat alone and allowed herself to fully consider the possibility she had been avoiding. What if the plan succeeded? What would her granddaughter lose? Control. Security. Independence. The thought made her chest tighten. She returned to the documents again, this time paying attention to language rather than content. Words like exclusive, irrevocable, and authorized appeared more than once. Even without full understanding, she knew these were not harmless terms. She did not take anything. She did not confront anyone. She only observed. By now, disbelief had faded into something heavier. Acceptance. The pieces fit together too cleanly to ignore. The conversation she overheard was not isolated. It was supported by behavior, timing, and paperwork. The calm confidence in the groom's voice now made sense. He believed everything was already under control. The grandmother felt a quiet fear settle in. Not panic. Not hysteria. A clear awareness of risk. Time, she realized, was the most dangerous factor of all. Each day closer to the wedding reduced the chance to intervene safely. Once vows were spoken, certain doors would close. She thought about speaking to the granddaughter again. About gently asking her to slow down, to read more carefully. But she feared resistance. Love often blocked warnings, especially when excitement was high. She also knew that confronting the groom directly would alert him. If he sensed suspicion, he might accelerate his plans. This was no longer about proving she was right. It was about protecting someone who trusted without question. The grandmother made another decision. She would gather enough clarity to speak with certainty, not speculation. She would choose her moment carefully. That night, she stood by the window, watching the lights of the house go dark one by one. The wedding was close now. So close that most people could only see celebration ahead. She saw something else. She saw a narrow window where action was still possible. The truth, once doubted, now stood firmly before her. The danger was real. And silence, she understood, would not protect anyone. For the first time since the wedding plans began, she felt something stronger than fear. Resolve. Once the truth settled in her mind, the grandmother understood that acting too quickly could undo everything. Confrontation might feel right in the moment, but it often warned the very people it was meant to stop. She had seen that happen before. Those who planned quietly depended on being underestimated. So she chose silence. Not the silence of fear or helplessness, but the silence of control. The house remained busy as ever. Wedding plans moved forward without pause. Guests confirmed attendance. Final fittings were scheduled. The granddaughter's excitement grew brighter with each passing day. To everyone else, nothing had changed. The grandmother made sure of that. She smiled when asked how she felt. She offered help when needed. She listened more than she spoke. If anyone noticed her watching more closely than before, they said nothing. Inside, however, she was working carefully through her next steps. She knew she could not do this alone. She also knew she could not speak openly. Any hint of alarm might reach the groom, and that was a risk she could not take. Whatever protection she planned had to happen quietly, without leaving a trail. She thought carefully about who to trust. It had to be someone who understood facts, not emotions. Someone who could look at documents and behavior without bias. Someone who knew how timing and legality worked. And most importantly, someone who could keep a secret. The decision came to her late one night as she sat reviewing her notes once more. There was one person she had known for years, someone who had once helped her through a complicated matter long ago. They were not close socially, but they were reliable. She reached out the next morning under an ordinary excuse. A simple request for advice. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. They agreed to meet quietly. The grandmother chose her words carefully during that meeting. She did not accuse. She did not speculate. She presented only what she knew for certain. Timelines. Phrases she had overheard. Patterns she had observed. Copies of documents she had seen, described from memory rather than produced. She made it clear she was not asking for action yet. Only understanding. The professional listened without interruption. They asked precise questions. When they spoke, it was measured and calm. They did not dismiss her concerns, nor did they exaggerate them. What they said confirmed what the grandmother already sensed. Certain situations required patience. Certain truths carried more weight when revealed at the right moment. Acting too early could weaken the outcome. They advised her to continue doing exactly what she was doing. Observe. Document. Avoid confrontation. Let events move forward naturally while preparations happened quietly behind the scenes. The grandmother felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that she was not imagining the danger. Fear because now she understood just how serious it was. She thanked them and left without drawing attention. From that moment on, the wedding became something else entirely for her. It was no longer just a celebration. It was a stage. She paid attention to every interaction involving paperwork. She noticed who handled envelopes, who spoke during meetings, and who avoided certain topics. Each detail was carefully stored away in her mind. She did not interfere when the granddaughter signed documents. She did not ask questions in front of others. Any concern she had was shared only in private, only when necessary. The groom remained confident. If he sensed anything, he gave no sign. His behavior stayed consistent, almost relaxed. That worried her more than if he had shown irritation. The closer the wedding came, the more pressure increased around timing. Last-minute confirmations. Urgent reminders. Everything needed to be completed before the ceremony. The grandmother understood now why haste was so important. Still, she said nothing. At night, she sometimes questioned herself. Was she doing the right thing by staying quiet? Would silence cost more than it saved? Each time doubt crept in, she returned to the facts. Not feelings. Facts. Emotion could cloud judgment. Drama could destroy credibility. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could protect. She watched the granddaughter sleep one evening, exhausted from preparations, trusting that everything was being handled responsibly. The sight strengthened her resolve. If protection required patience, she would be patient. She adjusted her behavior slightly, just enough to avoid drawing attention. She asked fewer questions. She appeared more relaxed. She allowed others to assume everything was settled. Behind that calm exterior, unseen preparations continued. Documents were quietly reviewed. Timelines were noted. Legal boundaries were clarified. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was exposed. The grandmother understood that the truth would surface on its own, but only if the right conditions were in place. The wedding date approached quickly now. Days felt shorter. Conversations moved faster. Everyone else felt relief that things were finally coming together. The grandmother felt something else. Readiness. She did not know exactly how events would unfold, only that they would. The plan she overheard depended on certainty. On no one looking too closely. She was looking closely. As she stood quietly during one of the final family gatherings, listening to laughter and toasts, she felt the weight of what she was carrying. No one else knew. No one else needed to. The wedding would proceed as planned. But the outcome would not. The wedding day arrived wrapped in light and warmth. Morning sun spilled across the venue, soft and golden, as if the world itself had chosen to be gentle. Cars lined the entrance. Guests stepped out dressed in their best, smiling, greeting one another with excitement that had been building for months. Music drifted through the air, steady and welcoming. To anyone watching, it was a perfect beginning. The grandmother arrived early, as she always did. She preferred to see things before they filled with people. It helped her feel grounded. She took in the details slowly, the chairs arranged with care, the flowers placed just right, the quiet hum of preparation behind the scenes. Everything was beautiful. Everything was orderly. She found her seat and sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face showed nothing more than calm anticipation. No one would have guessed the weight she carried inside. Guests continued to arrive, filling the rows with color and conversation. Laughter echoed softly. Phones were raised for photos. Compliments passed easily between relatives who hadn't seen each other in years. It was the kind of day people remembered fondly. The grandmother watched it all without distraction. She noticed who moved where, who spoke to whom, and who stayed close to the groom. She did not stare. She did not frown. She simply observed. When the groom arrived, he looked exactly as expected. Confident. Relaxed. He greeted guests with ease, shaking hands, exchanging light jokes. There was no sign of nervousness. If anything, he appeared assured, as if everything was already decided. The grandmother recognized that confidence now. It no longer impressed her. She saw how he checked his watch more than once. How he spoke briefly with someone near the entrance and nodded with satisfaction. Whatever he was waiting for, he believed it was on track. Behind the scenes, preparations continued quietly. The grandmother did not involve herself. She knew her place now was to remain exactly where she was, visible, calm, and unremarkable. Music shifted gently as the ceremony time approached. Guests took their seats. Conversations softened into whispers. Anticipation settled over the crowd. The granddaughter appeared moments later. She was radiant. Her smile was effortless, her posture relaxed. She looked like someone stepping confidently into a future she believed was safe. As she walked forward, heads turned, and admiration filled the space. The grandmother felt pride rise in her chest, followed immediately by a familiar ache. She watched every step her granddaughter took, remembering how small those steps once were. How she had learned to walk by holding onto furniture, trusting that something solid would always be there. The groom's expression softened as he saw her. To everyone else, it looked like love. To the grandmother, it looked like satisfaction. The ceremony began. Words about commitment and partnership floated through the air. Promises were spoken aloud, each one met with approving nods. The setting was peaceful. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing felt out of place. The grandmother listened carefully, though her thoughts stayed anchored elsewhere. She knew which moments mattered and which were simply for show. As the ceremony progressed, she noticed the groom glance briefly toward a small table near the side, where documents had been placed earlier. The glance was quick, almost invisible. No one else seemed to notice. The grandmother did. She adjusted slightly in her seat, steadying her breath. Everything was unfolding exactly as predicted. Guests smiled as the vows continued. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. It was a scene designed to distract, to soften attention, to make everyone feel safe. The grandmother remained still. She felt no urge to interrupt. No urge to speak. The time for words had passed. When the ceremony reached its final moments, applause filled the air. The newly married couple turned toward the guests, beaming. The groom's confidence seemed complete now, as if a door had just closed behind him. The grandmother stood with the others, clapping politely, her expression warm and approving. Anyone watching would have seen nothing unusual. Inside, she felt something different. Certainty. The wedding day had begun exactly as planned. The groom believed everything was secure. The granddaughter believed she was stepping into a future built on trust. And the grandmother sat quietly among the guests, knowing that what mattered most had not yet happened. The calm was not peace. It was simply the moment before truth revealed itself. For a brief moment after the applause faded, everything seemed to pause. The music softened. Guests began to rise from their seats, preparing to move toward congratulations and celebration. Smiles lingered, and a sense of relief passed through the room. Then someone stepped forward. It was subtle at first. Not dramatic. Not loud. A small movement near the front drew the attention of those closest to the aisle. A quiet exchange of words followed. The music stopped completely. The shift was immediate. People turned in their seats, unsure why the moment was stretching longer than expected. A few guests laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the program or a minor delay. Someone whispered a question. No one answered. The grandmother remained seated, her posture unchanged. She did not look surprised. She did not look anxious. She simply waited. An official voice spoke calmly but clearly, asking for the couple's attention. The tone carried authority, not emotion. It was the kind of voice used for procedure, not celebration. The groom's smile faltered. At first, it was barely noticeable. A small hesitation. A blink that lasted half a second too long. He turned slightly, confused, expecting reassurance or explanation. None came. Another official stepped forward, holding a folder. Papers were visible inside. The sound of pages shifting echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Guests fell silent. The granddaughter looked between the officials and the groom, her expression uncertain. She still did not appear afraid, only confused. She had no reason yet to feel otherwise. The groom opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. His confidence, once effortless, began to crack. He asked what this was about, trying to keep his voice light. The answer was direct. Certain documents, it was explained, required review. Certain actions taken in preparation for the marriage had raised concerns. Until clarification was completed, parts of the proceedings would need to pause. A murmur spread through the guests. Chairs shifted. People leaned toward one another, whispering questions. The groom's posture stiffened. He attempted to laugh it off, suggesting a misunderstanding. He spoke quickly now, words overlapping. The calm control he had shown for weeks slipped away. The officials did not respond to his tone. They responded with facts. Dates were mentioned. Forms were referenced. Statements were made about authorization and consent. Each word landed carefully, deliberately. The grandmother listened, her hands still folded. Everything she had prepared for was unfolding exactly as advised. The groom's face lost its color. He glanced around the room, searching for support, for confusion he could use to regain control. But the room was no longer distracted. Every eye was on him now. The granddaughter turned toward him fully. Her confusion shifted into something sharper. She asked what they were talking about. He hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than anything else. The officials explained that certain arrangements had been initiated without full clarity or independent review. That some documents carried implications that had not been openly discussed. The room held its breath. The groom tried again to interrupt, to explain, but his words tangled. Confidence gave way to defensiveness. His carefully measured tone dissolved. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. The grandmother did not move. She did not look at the groom. She watched her granddaughter. The young woman's face changed as understanding began to form. Not full understanding yet, but enough to know something important had been hidden from her. The officials stated clearly that the process would continue only after proper review and confirmation of consent. Nothing would proceed automatically. The groom's plan, whatever shape it had taken, relied on certainty, on silence, on no one stepping in. That certainty was gone. He stood frozen, exposed not by accusation but by process. By truth presented calmly, publicly, and without drama. Whispers filled the room now, no longer contained. People spoke openly, confusion turning into concern. Some looked toward the grandmother, sensing she knew more than she showed. She remained still. The officials concluded their statement and stepped back, waiting. The wedding had not been stopped with anger or confrontation. It had been paused by reality. The groom's confidence collapsed entirely. He no longer looked in control. He looked cornered. The grandmother finally stood, slowly, calmly, as if responding to nothing more than a change in schedule. She did not speak. She did not need to. The truth had surfaced. And there was no way to hide it now. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise could have been. The room that had been filled with music and celebration only moments earlier now held confusion, disbelief, and fear. No one knew where to look. Some guests remained standing, unsure whether to sit again or leave. Others whispered openly, no longer trying to hide their shock. The groom was asked to step aside. At first, he resisted in small ways. He argued quietly, insisting there had been a mistake. He asked for time, for privacy, for a chance to explain. His voice lacked the smooth confidence it once had. Each word sounded thinner than the last. The officials did not argue back. They did not raise their voices. They simply repeated what needed to happen next. When he was finally guided away from the front, a visible shift passed through the room. This was no longer a delay. This was a consequence. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared openly, trying to understand how a celebration had turned into something unrecognizable. A few stood frozen, hands still holding phones that had been recording moments meant to last forever. The grandmother remained where she was. She watched the groom disappear from view, his shoulders tight, his head lowered. The plan he believed was invisible had collapsed under the weight of truth. Not because someone shouted, not because accusations flew, but because it had been brought into the open. The granddaughter stood motionless at the center of it all. For a moment, she seemed detached from what was happening around her, as if her mind needed time to catch up. Then reality reached her. Her breath changed. Her hands trembled slightly. She looked around the room, searching for answers that no one could give her fast enough. Someone gently guided her to a seat. The grandmother rose and moved toward her without hesitation. She did not rush. She did not push through the crowd. She simply went to where she was needed most. She sat beside her granddaughter and placed a hand over hers. No words came at first. The granddaughter's eyes filled with tears she did not yet let fall. Her face held devastation, confusion, and disbelief all at once. She whispered a question no one could fully answer. How did this happen? The grandmother did not respond immediately. She squeezed her hand gently, grounding her. She knew this was not the moment for explanations or lessons. This was the moment for presence. Around them, the room slowly began to empty. Some guests left quietly, unsure of what else to do. Others stayed behind, gathering in small groups, replaying events in hushed voices. As the space cleared, understanding began to settle among the family. They spoke softly at first. Then more openly. Pieces of information came together. Conversations from earlier weeks. The rush around paperwork. The constant reassurance that everything was handled. What had once seemed organized now looked calculated. Shock gave way to clarity. The granddaughter listened as details emerged, each one cutting deeper than the last. She realized how much she had trusted without question. How often she had stepped back, believing love meant letting someone else lead. The truth hurt. But it also protected her. As the weight of what almost happened became clear, something shifted within her. The devastation remained, but beneath it grew understanding. She began to see that love without honesty was not love at all. It was control disguised as care. The grandmother stayed close throughout it all. She did not say she had been right. She did not explain how long she had known. She did not place herself at the center of the story. She listened. When the granddaughter cried, she held her. When words failed, she stayed quiet. Her support came not from advice, but from steadiness. Later, when the room had nearly emptied, the granddaughter finally looked at her grandmother and spoke softly. "Thank you for staying," she said. The grandmother nodded. That was all. She understood that the road ahead would not be easy. Trust once broken did not heal quickly. Dreams reshaped themselves slowly, often painfully. But her granddaughter was safe. That mattered more than anything. The wedding had ended, but something else had begun. The family left the venue together, not celebrating, but united in relief and understanding. What had been prevented would never fully be known, but its absence was felt. As they stepped into the evening air, the grandmother walked beside her granddaughter, their pace unhurried. She had chosen silence when it mattered most. And because of that, truth had found its way forward. The days that followed felt quiet in a way the grandmother had not experienced in years. Not empty, not lonely, but still. The kind of quiet that comes after something heavy has passed through and left its mark. The granddaughter stayed with family. She did not rush to make decisions or explain anything to anyone outside the circle that mattered. Some mornings she slept late. Other days she woke early and sat by the window, watching the light change as if she were learning how to see the world again. People came and went gently. They brought food, warm words, and company without pressure. No one asked her what she would do next. No one demanded strength from her before she was ready. That made all the difference. The grandmother stayed close, but never crowded. She understood that healing did not follow instructions. It followed time. Sometimes the granddaughter wanted to talk. She asked quiet questions about trust, about how someone could hide so much behind kindness. The grandmother answered honestly, but simply. She did not analyze or judge. She spoke about patterns, about patience, about how truth often revealed itself slowly. Other times, the The granddaughter said nothing at all. She sat beside her grandmother in silence, the two of them sharing space without expectation. Those moments mattered just as much. As the shock faded, understanding deepened. The granddaughter began to see the past clearly. She remembered moments she had dismissed, conversations she had brushed aside, times she had felt rushed but told herself it was normal. She did not blame herself. Instead, she learned. She learned that trust did not mean stepping back completely. That love did not require giving up control of one's own choices. That kindness without honesty was not kindness at all. The wedding that never fully happened became something else in her memory. Not a failure, but a turning point. A moment when harm was stopped before it could settle in permanently. The grandmother reflected quietly during those days. She thought about the long path that had led her there. About how difficult it had been to stay silent when speaking up felt easier. About how restraint often carried a heavier cost than confrontation. Silence, she knew, was often misunderstood. It could look like weakness. It could feel like fear. But chosen carefully, it could also be protection. She had learned that patience was not passive. It was active, demanding constant awareness and control. It required trust in timing, not impulse. She also understood the risk she had taken. Waiting could have gone wrong. The truth could have arrived too late. But this time it had not. As the days turned into weeks, the granddaughter slowly returned to herself. Her laughter came back in pieces, softer at first. She began to plan again, not for a wedding, but for her own life. She made choices carefully now. Asked questions. Took time. The grandmother watched her with quiet pride. One evening, they sat together as the sun set, the sky shifting through familiar colors. The granddaughter spoke without looking up. "I thought love meant trusting without limits," she said. The grandmother waited before answering. "Love grows best with truth," she replied. "And truth needs space to breathe." The granddaughter nodded, absorbing the words. They did not speak again for a while. Life moved forward, not dramatically, but steadily. The family adjusted. Conversations became lighter again. The shadow of what almost happened faded, though it never fully disappeared. And that was okay. Some lessons were meant to stay. The grandmother knew that her role in the story would never be fully understood by everyone. Some might always wonder why she waited, why she did not speak sooner. She accepted that. Protection did not always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like sitting quietly and trusting the truth to arrive on its own terms. As she watched her granddaughter one afternoon, smiling with genuine ease for the first time in weeks, the grandmother felt peace settle in her chest. Not pride. Peace. She had done what needed to be done. The story did not end with applause or celebration. It ended with something stronger. Clarity. And the quiet understanding that sometimes protecting someone doesn't mean stopping the moment. It means letting the truth arrive at exactly the right time.